So I'm also painfully aware that the reality is that I'm between you and lunch. So I'll try to keep this to the point and get you guys to the real food and not let you suffer with just virtual food. So it's interesting. I was sitting through some of the talks, and some of the forecasts of the future, while at the time kind of struck me as um, maybe a little aggressive, but in some ways they actually struck me as a little bit conservative. And there was no collusion between the slides. In fact, as far as I know, my slide deck was finished sometime this morning. So you're actually going to see some things in my deck that actually reflect a little bit some of the talks you've seen before. So maybe we're all equally crazy, or maybe there's actually something to this. So let me dive into it. So this is not anything new to any of you all, but VR is going to touch a lot of people in a lot of different ways. The way you probably think of most is gaming, and I think that's probably going to be the core of VR. But there's a lot of other markets that are already diving really deep into VR. The design market. In fact, there's a bunch of auto manufacturers who'd love to sit you down in the seat of that McLaren P1, well, or maybe a Prius if $1 million car isn't your thing, and let you experience it without having to fly you to the factory or put you in the seat of that $1 million car. The entertainment industry is going to be transformed too. That was mentioned a little bit earlier. Films are going to be that experience is going to have to transform because it can't just be linear. The modern CG movies, of course, they model what's on the camera, but what happens with the guy with the head mount turns around and you see backstage in a CG movie. Well, that doesn't exist. They're going to have to think about how they're going to steer that experience and let it still be immersive. News is going to be transformed by VR. Real estate, that's a huge one. The virtual tour already exists. Why not do it the virtual tour for real? Put the head mount display on, really experience a look around the house before you make the purchase. And then, of course, there's a lot of, I call them art, but just experiences that we might not really be aware of yet. If you haven't had a chance to try it yet, one of the demos for the HTC Valve Vive is the tilt brush, which is painting in VR. And it doesn't seem like, oh yeah, of course, painting in VR, but it's almost a transformative experience. And it was one of those aha moments for me because I have approximately no real creative ability. I have a little bit of mathematical skill, but no ability to paint. But just waving the controller and creating pixels and walking around it really created a whole new experience. And I think that's going to kind of unleash a whole new genre of things that people are going to want to experience. The challenge, of course, and Shavat and others, I broke it. All right, it's fine. The challenge, of course, is that VR is hard. To do VR properly requires an enormous amount of horsepower. Is this still working? Hello? Yeah, Bueller? Yeah. Traditional computer games these days are run on an HD monitor. That's 1920 by 1080, that's 2 million pixels, that's 60 frames per second. Most of the gamer class head-mounted displays are much higher resolution, much higher frame rate. Today's gamer class head-mount display needs about 7 times the horsepower of a traditional PC game. That's a pretty daunting challenge, and even that's not what we consider perfect or reality. So we're investing heavily into making sure that the horsepower is going to exist so that the creative folks can create those experiences that we all desire, reality in a head-mounted display. One of the other big challenges, which Shavat alluded to, was the latency challenge. So this is one of the big ones in that this is the thing that gets you sick if you do it wrong. Really, the important part is that as your head moves around, as you track it, the response that you see on the screen needs to be kind of connected to what your brain thinks is going on. And that entire loop of moving your head around, getting the sensor data from moving your head around into the computer, rendering a picture that represents that reaction, and then getting it to the screen so that your eyes can pick it up in less than 20 milliseconds is a pretty big challenge. To put that in perspective, most game consoles, when you play on a flat screen TV in your living room, from your button pressing to what you see on the screen is between 100 and 150 milliseconds. So we have to do 7 times more immersive or 7 times more complex rendering in about 1/5 of the time. That's a big challenge. And that's something that Nvidia is all about. We're building graphic technology that's specifically designed to kind of cross that chasm for VR. But of course, VR, as we know, and as Hilmar talked about, it's been here a few times, in fact. I was at Silicon Graphics kind of in the early cave days with Jared Lanier and the dreadlocks and $1 million SGI Onyx rigs to do virtual reality. And then there was the Nintendo generation of virtual reality. It's been here a few times, and so we really need to figure out a way to solve that chicken and egg problem. One is solve the technical barriers so they can be real, and then solve the make it everywhere barrier so that it can be a real market. and we can all thrive, and it can become kind of the next big thing. So what are we doing to kind of solve the chicken problem, which is the technology and the ecosystem? We're investing in a wide variety of spaces, and we're kind of touching a lot of different pieces of the VR ecosystem. We're working with Valve and Oculus, the folks that are making the headsets and the platforms, at least some of the big ones, as well as folks like GameFace to embed Nvidia technology into their SDKs so that we can reduce the latency and improve the quality of the rendering, or even Nvidia technology directly in the head-mounted display itself. We're working closely with folks like Epic and game engine companies to make sure that their technologies, their engines, take advantage of all the latest features that our GPUs and our software can do to advance VR, and I'll show you some of that today, and I'll even roll the dice by rolling a live demo. Application developers, folks like Hilmar at CCP are leading the way creating great games. We've been working with Hilmar and the folks at CCP for a really long time, and I've had the pleasure of, in fact, I was there at Reykjavik when they rolled it out to the fans, and you had this look of wonder, which is pretty awesome. I think we're onto something, and I think it's not just a cool fad. I think there's a real experience there people are going to latch onto. And then, of course, for capture and streaming, we talked about video. There's a huge number of companies that are creating immersive experiences. I've seen one that was actually a surround immersive VR experience from the war in Afghanistan. And that's, I have an enormous amount of respect even before I experienced that, but now when you're actually literally in live action with bullets whizzing around and explosions going off, it gives me a whole new appreciation for the bravery and the courage that those folks put on. So we're working with folks like VideoStitch that take the input from a variety of cameras that can be cylinders or spheres and create immersive, stitched together worlds, and they're using our GPUs to do things like that. We've created an SDK that has a whole bunch of technologies designed specifically around virtual reality. One of the ones that I'm going to talk to you about the most today is multi-res shading, so I'll come back to that. But we've done things like VR SLI. So if you aren't familiar with it, Nvidia can gang multiple graphics processors together to give you more horsepower. The challenge with that, traditionally as it applies to VR, is the way we do that is what's called alternate frame rendering. One GPU renders one frame, another GPU renders the other frame, and then you go back and forth. The bummer with that is that they're serial. One is after another. And remember that latency challenge I talked about where you have to get this all done in 20 milliseconds? We don't want to serialize things, so we invented VR SLI so that one GPU renders one eye and the other GPU renders the other eye at the same time. You get twice the GPU horsepower with no added latency. We've invented some other things, for example, like VR direct mode, which basically treats the VR like its own unique display so the Windows desktop doesn't pop up on it, so you get lower latency. And we integrated that, for example, with Oculus into their SDK. There's a bunch of other things we've done, for example, warp and blend. This is for the professional industry that are starting to do really large-scale immersive design reviews, replacing what used to be a power wall for an automotive design review now with a head-mounted display. Or say GPU Direct for video. I mentioned those folks that are capturing video and then stitching it together to give that immersive experience. Well, they can now feed those video captures directly into the GPU without copies through memory and things like that, which makes it more efficient, reduces the latency, and can improve the performance of it. But let me talk to you a little about multi-res rendering. And someone earlier mentioned foveated rendering. So the notion here is that in a virtual world, in a head-mounted world, most of the information that you're seeing is towards the center. And the periphery of the screen is less important because you're generally not looking there. Also, it tends to be that at least in current generation head-mount displays, the periphery is actually inherently lower resolution because of the way the optics are warping the display. It tends to just kind of blur out toward the edges. Now, the disadvantage is that in the real-time world with graphics, we have to render all of those pixels. And historically, you have to render all those pixels with equal resolution because there hasn't really been a way to put the resolution where the user wants. So what we thought is, well, why do you have to do that? Why don't we put the resolution where the user's looking and put lower resolution where the user's not looking? So we invented multi-resolution shading. So what you see here is an image. We've actually integrated this into Epic's Unreal Engine 4. It'll be available in the next couple of months. This is the standard resolution image. And if you can't tell the difference, that's intended. This is actually what it looks like in multi-resolution. So what's going on here? How do we do this? We actually architected into our latest generation of GPUs, this is the Maxwell architecture, or the 9 series GTX GPUs, the ability to render into multiple viewports, or call it multiple windows, simultaneously in a single pass. So what we do is we split the screen up into 9 regions, or viewports, and the periphery, or the edges, we render at lower resolution, and in the center, we render at full resolution. And we can do that by distributing the geometry, all those viewports, in a single pass, and then rendering the fragments at the resolution that's appropriate for their position on the screen. So in this case, we've got splits that are 38% in from the edge, and the periphery rend at 60% lower resolution. In fact, generally, you probably can't even tell the difference between the multi-resolution on and the multi-resolution off image. The advantage is that we've saved a bunch of work. You don't have to spend precious GPU horsepower rendering pixels that no one's ever going to see or aren't going to make any difference. And so in this case, we've got about 58% of the original pixels, so you can get a theoretical speedup of about 1.7x. So why is that important? Why do we care about benchmarks and 1.7x in VR? Well, remember when we talked about the challenge of VR, and it has 7 times the computational horsepower requirements? Well, one of them is it needs to, today, get over 90 frames per second per eye. And what that means is you have to tune your content to get over that threshold, or you get stutter, and that breaks the immersion. You don't want this kind of staccato feeling of irregular motion. You want a perfectly smooth 90 hertz. And that's kind of this kind of sweet spot between no motion blur, no flashing pixels, and no stutter. And that has to do with the display technology we're using right now. So if you want the higher quality visuals, you either have to throw a lot more horsepower at it, or you have to find a way to do this more intelligently, and that's what multi-resolution shading is about. So why don't we take a look at it? I'm going to roll the dice with a live demo here, so if we can cut to the demo. Okay, so what we're at right now, if you look at the top, I guess your top right-hand corner there, this is multi-resolution shading off. This is Epic's Unreal Engine 4. This is their kind of reflection subway demo. So this is some pretty high-quality real-time rendering, but at 60 frames a second or even 70 frames per second, it's not going to make the cut for VR, because we need to be able to do this at over 90 frames per second. So why don't we go ahead and turn multi-resolution on. There you go. Could you guys tell any difference in the image quality? Probably not. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of drive around a little bit. Let's not go too fast, because this is kind of an example of state-of-the-art engine technology from the folks at Epic. They've worked with us to integrate multi-resolution into their engine. It'll be out in the next couple of months. And the benefit here is you can deliver much higher quality visuals by putting the resolution where people see it and putting low resolution where they don't. And in fact, in this case, you're watching this not being in a head-mount display, on a traditional kind of display. And even in this case, where there's no lens warping or anything else going on at the periphery, you still can't tell the difference. So this is like free performance. Who doesn't like free performance? It's like free money. And now just extend this one notch further. Use 2 GPUs. You can get this level of immersive realism in today's head-mounted displays without having to have crazy, $19,000 rigs. This is PC technology that's a $300 graphics card. It's quite a bit more capable than that of PS4, but this is kind of the baseline for VR. So this is multi-resolution. Why don't we turn it off again? Yeah, can't really tell a difference. Look around and then turn it on. Yeah, so I'm kind of crazy to run a live demo, but that's okay. So that's multi-resolution. So that's one example of some technology that we're working on. So we can go back to the slides. Is that cool? Yeah? Yeah? Who doesn't like free perf? So thanks to the folks at Epic. I think Tim's here somewhere, so make sure you thank Tim for working with us on that. So this is, like I said, this is an example of that. So this is all delivered in the GameWorks VR SDK, which you can get off NVIDIA's website. In general, the mileage will vary, and this is something you all will have to experience, or at least the content creators will experiment with. Different games and different content, you can put more or less resolution where you want it. It's all programmable. It's up to you. So in this case, we had about a 50% increase in performance, but there's cases where we can get a 2x increase in performance, again, without any loss in image quality at all. So what does that mean? Well, that one way means you can get better quality visuals, and that's the example of what we're getting here. But another way this can be used, I mentioned that one already, is that it can still help to advance the availability of VR. So if VR is a chicken and egg problem, one of the sides of it is the technology challenge. We have to help solve the technology challenges to make it more pervasive. So we're working hard on that with GameWorks VR. The other one, of course, is we want everyone to be VR capable. And VR for NVIDIA primarily means the gamer-grade head-mounted displays. The mobile displays are amazing too, but I think there's going to be a kind of a different class of experience for those. We're working hard there as well. The folks like GameFace are using NVIDIA for their head-mounted display that's a mobile class display. But Oculus has decided that the kind of the baseline for their experience is going to be a GTX 970. And I guess how did they arrive at that? They arrived at it because they wanted something that could deliver what I would call current generation class visuals. And so a GTX 970, roughly speaking, is about twice the performance of a PlayStation 4. So you can kind of deliver current generation visuals, but in a head-mounted display because you've got that higher resolution and you've got the higher frame rate requirement as well, of course, in stereo. So we're helping to kind of push on that. But the problem with that is like, gosh, how many of those are out there? There's a little bit of concern, like if I push the bar too high for technology, you might be able to deliver a good experience, but there'll only be like 4 people with those rigs, and then no one can make any money, and that's not good for anyone. So this is real live data here. This is Nvidia only. So in 2015, there's about 5 million PCs out there right now. Before VR has really become a big thing, there's a couple 100,000 dev kits out there, but before it's become a big thing for consumers that are capable of that. So 5 million is a good place to start, and certainly a good place to start for developers. But I think we want to get to the place where there's kind of tens of millions. Then we can kind of count on I'll call it the infrastructure of the PC and the gaming PCs being there, such that it's not this kind of transitional, transformative thing where you have to go spend $1,500 on a PC and a few $100s on a headset. Everyone's going to have a PC. There's hundreds of millions, maybe billions of PC gamers. But how do we get them to all be capable of VR? So the beautiful thing about the PC industry and the beautiful thing about the graphics industry that Nvidia is driving is that graphics get faster. Every year, graphics get faster. We've been on this faster than Moore's Law pace for graphics for about 2 decades, about the length of time I've been in that industry. Not only do they get faster, but the corollary to that is the same level of performance gets cheaper or more accessible. So what this graph is showing you, kind of that egg piece of the chicken and egg, is that if you hold that level of performance constant, which is that GTX 970, or roughly twice the level of a PS4, and you just march that forward in time, if we did nothing, if VR doesn't happen or it does, if Nvidia doesn't invent something cool or it does, if we just kind of keep going like we've been going, there'll be 100 million PCs capable of running that level of horsepower in 5 years. That's pretty huge. That's certainly a market that can be real. That's bigger than any of the existing console markets by themselves. In fact, the only kind of gaming device gadget that's bigger than that would be the Nintendo DS. So 13 million of those by next year. So that's starting to get to the point where it's kind of interesting. Remember when we talked about multi-res and how not only could it bring better visuals, but because it kind of gives you free performance, you can take that level of visual and you can now run it on a lower end piece of hardware, something that's more affordable, something that's more accessible. And so with that, you can kind of think of it as some technology that kind of brings the future forward. And there's two things that are exciting to me. One, next year, that means there'll be 25 million PCs just from NVIDIA alone capable of running that class of content. That's pretty substantial. That's a capability beyond that of a console, and there's 25 million NVIDIA alone. Or another way to think about it, it brings that kind of, I'll call it the 100 million point in to 4 years. 100 million devices will deliver that kind of capability within 4 years, and within 5 years will be 130 million. And I think it was Jeff's slide deck that suggested there'd be 128 million PCs capable of VR or VR experience gamer headsets. And I think that was by 2020. Well, funny, we have 130 million, so we were off by 2 million. There was no collusion there, and that's NVIDIA only. So we're driving really hard towards solving that kind of chicken and egg problem so that there's a huge install base of capable hardware ready for a great VR experience. But as Hilmar said, we're just at the start. VR's got lots of momentum, certainly lots of excitement and hype, and there's lots of innovation going on for VR. So I kind of think of it as a little bit like maybe climbing Everest. The idea being that first we have to solve a bunch of hard technical problems. A lot of them have started to be solved. In fact, this generation of VR kind of leverages some things that happened in the industry that had nothing to do with VR. For example, the commoditization of the head-mounted display. Prior generations, you had to build special purpose technology or it was super expensive. Back in the early SGI days, you had these caves, or even before that with Evans and Sutherland, these crazy head-mounted displays that were basically science projects and not commodities. Today's head-mounted displays can use technology from the cell phone industry, and there's billions of those. They have detailed exact sensors. They have low-cost screens that are high resolution. There's other industries now that have helped kind of fuel along this drive towards commoditization of VR. And the technology that we're developing will help to kind of intersect the performance capability required for that with the increasingly diminishing cost of VR. By 2020, the cost of doing a high-quality VR PC, it'll be a $99 graphics card. I'm not sure what the head-mount display, but that's a very low barrier to entry. Certainly, it's not going to stop someone who wants to game in VR from gaming in VR. So that's the kind of crossing the crevice. We want to make sure that there's a large, rich ecosystem so that once we get there and we kind of look at this, look around at the summit, we can get to that next level of experience. And what you're seeing behind this image here is actually an image from a forthcoming experience from the folks at Solfar. So we've been working with those folks. This is not a photograph. This is actually an image from an upcoming VR experience where you actually climb Everest without the nasty, frostbite and death. And if you haven't had a chance to experience it, it's going to be announced in the next couple of days. It's really stunning. It really gives you a sense of scale and scope about really just how long that trek is. I mean, when you think about climbing Everest, it's not like a little face. It's a multi-month hike up a mountain. And then when you get to the top, it's really quite breathtaking. Even in VR, to be able to essentially look around at the top of the world and look at the mountains, look at China, look at Nepal, look at Tibet, in an experience that's, well, probably as close as I'm going to get to really summiting Everest. But that's the kind of thing that's the promise that VR gives us. Let us experience things that we couldn't experience otherwise. Get that sense of wonder back when we were a kid, when we first played our first video game, and now it's this whole new level. And so NVIDIA is working really hard to solve the technical challenges, put the big installed base so we can all build something new and amazing and summit Everest. So that's what I had for my talk. If you got questions, I'm happy to take them. And otherwise, I'm sure the stomachs are rumbling and the call of the food is strong. Any questions? No? Okay, excellent. Thank you.